Good afternoon, everyone. It's not the way we do it at PACE. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. Hello and welcome to the 2023 Blaine Sloan Lecture on International Law. I am Horace Anderson, Dean of the Elisabeth Haub School of Law at PACE University. We are pleased and honored today to have with us the Consul General of Mexico to the United States in New York, Jorge Islas Lopez, a widely renowned constitutional law expert and human rights advocate, who will deliver our 2023 Blaine Sloan Lecture on the topic, the consular duty and the protection of human rights in New York. The Blaine Sloan Lecture on International Law honors F. Blaine Sloan for developing the international law program at PACE. A member of the United Nations Legal Office for 3 decades and director of the General Legal Division, Professor Sloan contributed significantly to the development of both public and private international law. Blaine Sloan represented the Secretary General at the 1978 UN Conference on the Carriage of Goods by Sea, also at the sessions from 1969 to 1978 of the UN Commission on International Trade Law, or UNCITRAL, also at the 1966 to 1978 sessions of the Legal Subcommittee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. His UN service involved him in that organization's work on the war in Vietnam, on relief for Palestinian refugees, on peacekeeping in the Middle East, and on the UN Commission on Korea. He also served as legal advisor to Security Council sessions in Africa and Latin America. Recently, I had the privilege of traveling with PACE University President Marvin Krislov to Mexico, where we met with the Consul General and with officials at several Mexican universities to discuss collaborations related to academic exchanges, collaborative research, and dual degree programs. The Consul General has been instrumental in helping us foster relationships that we hope will lead to future partnerships with those universities. President Krislov has joined us today for this event, and I'd like to invite him up to introduce our speaker.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I thought you'd warm them up, Horace. Good afternoon, everybody. All right, it's a great day to be here. I'm really excited to be part of the Blaine Sloan Lecture and to learn more about Professor Sloan. And I can think of no one better qualified to present this year's lecture than my good friend, Jorge Islas Lopez, the Consul General of Mexico in New York. He is an attorney with a law degree and a doctorate in law from UNAM in Mexico City and a Master of Law degree from Columbia. He is a distinguished constitutional law professor affiliated with 2 prestigious universities, UNAM and ITAM. But most importantly, he is recognized for his expertise in constitutional law and is a staunch defender of human rights. One of his top priorities as Consul General, a position he's held since 2019, is the defense of immigrants' rights, regardless of status. He'll be speaking today on consular duty and the protection of human rights. Among his many accomplishments, he wrote the first federal legislation in Mexico regarding class action and Mexico's Freedom of Information Act. He authored constitutional reforms for the states of Oaxaca and Michoacan. Is that correct? Yeah, okay. And served as an advisor for Mexico City's first constitution. He has served as the general counsel at UNAM. In fact, we were visiting UNAM together, and the current president wanted to have some informal legal advice from him. And he currently holds the Giovanni Satori chair at UNAM Law School. I want to say a few words about how kind and generous he has been to us at PACE. The former provost, Vani Quinones, and I met him actually at the Consulate of India, and we developed a relationship and we talked a little bit, and it took a while because of the pandemic, but he said to me, you need to understand the needs of the Mexican-American community in New York, and I think PACE can be an important partner in addressing those as well as developing relationships with universities. I said, it sounds good. And he delivered for us in a big way. He came to a lot of the meetings with us. We connected to 6 universities, and I'm pleased to report, particularly
for those of you from Haub Law, that the connections that he formed for us with Mexican law schools will stand us in very good stead as we build our international connections. And this is very, very positive. And it was very nice to have Diana Ramirez also with us on the trip as well. So the Consul General has not only talked about doing things, he has actually delivered. And that is so rare and so wonderful in this world. And I'm deeply grateful. And so without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our 2023 Blaine Sloan Lecturer on International Law, Consul General Jorge Islas Lopez.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's such a great pleasure to be here at Pace University Law School, Elisabeth Haub Law School, and to present the Blaine Sloan Lecture on International Law. I'm very, very grateful for the invitation from the university authorities, particularly from Horace Anderson, of course, and my dear friend, Maureen Christoph, the president of Pace University. Today, I would like to tell you a little bit about my venture as an academic into the world of diplomacy, about the challenges of running a big consulate in a major city like New York, and about the responsibility of protecting more than 1 million Mexicans in the state. The main objectives of this lecture, those will be the following. First, to introduce you to the transformation of the consular institution into international law. Secondly, to discuss the main challenges involved in consular activity in New York. And last but not least, to talk specifically about human rights that the consulate, such as the Mexican one, seeks to protect. At the end, I would like to leave a space for a Q&A session. And if you have some doubts, I'm ready to answer them. So allow me to start with a little bit of history. When most people think about consular matters, it's only because they are having difficulties in a foreign country or because they have to apply for a visa to travel or immigrate abroad. In fact, if you are planning to spend a semester studying abroad or to get a graduate degree outside of the United States, you might need to visit the consulate soon. I hope you will visit the Mexican consulate. You will have a nice experience there. However, this is not the only purpose of a consular office today. And it hasn't been only the purpose of consulates through history. Consular service was created in Egypt in the 6th century BC, with the main objective of encouraging trade with the Greeks at that time. Thus, they allowed them to establish codes, consular rules in Egypt. These governors had many of the characteristics of modern customs agents because their principal function were to encourage trade, act as magistrates for their merchants in Egypt, serve as the intermediate with the Egyptian authorities, and report back to their city-states on political and economic conditions. This institution was later inherited by the Romans, and thus far by the Western countries, and now worldwide. However, with the collapse of the Roman Empire, and then when we have the Dark Ages, it was not until the 11th and 12th century that the trading states of European countries began to resemble their systems of laws, codes, procedures, and commercial practices. With the codification of mercantile practices, consuls began to reappear to help merchants of their cities or states or foreign shores. By the 13th century, after Christ, Venice had more than 30 consuls placed abroad in Tunis, Alexandria, Cairo, and Damascus, as well in all the major European courts. I don't intend to turn this into a lecture about the history of international law. My intention, my main purpose, it's just give you a brief recollection of history. It's basically to show you how the consular institution has emerged over the time, transformed over the time according to new international needs. As we can see, originally, the institution was not created as an office to protect citizens abroad, which is the common coin today. Historically, a consulate was closer to the duties of a customs agent, as I was saying, who supervises imports and exports. Even if we take a big leap in history and think about the US as an independent country, we will find out that the Consular Act of 1792 contains nothing about assisting distressed US civilians abroad. Besides commercial duties and some other commercial rules, it includes the obligation of granting or denying visas to visitors who want to enter into the US at that time. Then, where does the idea of a consulate office protecting human rights come from? Well, each country has its own history, but in most cases, it came because of international conflict and basically wars. Consider, for example, the Mexico-United States conflict of 1846 in the 19th century. After the war ends in 1848, Mexico surrendered more than a half of its territory to the US. However, Mexican citizens continue to live in that territory. Those emergency consular offices were created to assist Mexican nationals who didn't want to remain in that part of the states. And I proudly and happily would like to add that since then, we have had a very important relation, a very intense diplomatic relation. And aside that we are neighbors, by now we are allies and we are partners. And let me tell you something. By now, the most important commercial partner of the USA is Mexico, beyond China. And in the next 15 or 20 years, the first minority in America, it's going to be they're going to be the Hispanics, and among them, the first minority, they're going to be Mexicans. So we by now are truly interconnected, and we have an intense relation that aside that the friendship and that we are neighbors, we are strategic partners and allies for important things for the future. So in that sense, I feel very proud to work in America for all these great purposes, that at the end, all that happens in America will happen to Mexico, and all the things that could happen to Mexico will happen to America. There is a huge integration by now. Similar scenarios have been witnessed in other international conflicts. In, for example, World War II, for example, ambassadors and consuls in different countries around the world took it upon themselves to provide assistance, as you may know, to their fellow nationals in order to escape from the conflict. On many occasions, they also support citizens of other nationalities becoming silent heroes. This is the case, for example, of a very well-known American hero, a consul at that time, Harry Binkman IV, who was vice consul in Marseille, France, at the time of the Nazi occupation. This great public servant helped the Jewish community that were living in Marseille, France. He helped close to 3,000 people to escape from that city to America. And thanks to him, these people find liberty, dignity, and with the great help of the American government and this important public servant, they find hope for the new challenges they have ahead. Consulates, therefore, are government institutions that have been forced to modify their functions and capacities, I will add, according to the political and social needs because as you may have studied in your course of law and society, legal institutions need to change in order to adapt to the social reality in which they exist. Today, the Vienna Convention includes more than 13 functions for a consulate, from the most basic, such as issuing passports and visas, to the most complex, such as developing the diplomatic relations and protecting the rights and interests of the nationals that live abroad. Let me now talk about protecting our people in our jurisdictions as consulates. This is a challenge itself because we live in a totally globalized world. Just for give you a number, in New York, 3.6 million people, over 8 million who are the residents of New York, are foreign nationals living in New York. They speak more than 800 languages other than English, and moreover, these people come from an immense variety of backgrounds. Shortly, I will go into more detail about the diversity of people we serve at the consulate. But to give you an example, on any given day, we may receive a tourist who lost his documents while taking a tour to the Statue of Liberty, a businesswoman looking to open a new restaurant in one of the most iconic avenues in New York City, a farm worker who had an accident in upstate New York, or a single mother who works as delivery person and is in a great need and is looking for health insurance for their child. This is the reality of New York City. Without necessarily talking about the entire state, just considering Manhattan, we are probably talking about the most diverse place in the world. The eyes of the globe are on New York, on its museums, its cultural displays, its stock markets, and of course, its universities. And New York welcomes the world with open arms. I can assure you that, because as Consul General, I have been witnessing the great support of the different authorities at state and municipal level, granting help for all the migrants. The local authorities, for example, have made New York a sanctuary city, as you may know, which means that they do not collaborate with the federal government to enforce immigration laws. This, to some extent, facilitates consular work, of course, especially when compared to consulates in southern states in America. However, New York has other features that also pose a challenge for consular offices. For example, it is the second city with the most consulates worldwide, with 116, only behind Hong Kong with 119. But we're not considering the 177 missions of the UN that are established in New York. This makes New York City the diplomatic capital worldwide. Therefore, in addition to the task of protecting the interests of our nationals, consulates have the duty to take care of the diplomatic interests of our country, each country's. To this end, we interact with federal, state, municipal authorities, non-profit organizations, citizen or religious organizations, economic agents, academic institutions, just to have an example. Not to mention, of course, the relation we must foster with other consulates or the services we must provide to the UN missions in the interests of our countries. Now that we have discussed the challenge of the consular service in New York, it is time to answer the main concern behind this lecture. What are the human rights we protect? And how do we protect the human rights in New York? I will begin by addressing the rights that every consular office has an obligation to protect. And then I will review the particular challenges of a consulate such as the Mexican consulate, which has more than 1 million nationals living in New York. The first and obvious right that I would like to talk about is the right to an identity. and the right to have a nationality, which involves, of course, the right to have a name, a surname, to have citizenship, and if we take a step further, even the right to residency. This is a right that practically all consulates should be responsible for protecting. It is set out in Article 5D of the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations, which states that consular functions include issuing passports and travel documents to nationals of the sending state, and in Article 5F, which includes acting as notary and civil registration. At first glance, this will seem to be an easy right to protect. We're talking about granting identity documents, travel documents, and birth records to persons who comply with certain rules according to law. One will simply have to comply with the laws and treaties on citizenship and dual nationality. Behind this right, however, lies a dark shadow that it's difficult to avoid. I'm referring, of course, to the immigration status. Every day at the Mexican consulate in New York, we receive tens, even hundreds of calls inquiring about requirements and assistance to regularize the immigration status of our nationals. In the meetings we have held with the Coalition for Latin American Consulates in New York, we have agreed that this common problem is common for all our communities. Defining immigration status, granting asylum and citizenship applications, unfortunately, does not depend on the consulates. It is the responsibility of federal authorities who often demand very tough standards that are difficult to gather. However, from the point of view of the consulates, there are different things we can do. To start with, the first one is, of course, to support our migrants in meeting the substantive and bureaucratic requirements for asylum applications and other figures that they are looking for. Another thing we can do, perhaps even more important, is work towards the recognition of the daily contributions of the thousands and maybe millions of undocumented workers in this country. And finally, we can work with the host community, with the New Yorkers who welcome us, with academic communities like Pace University, to raise awareness and advocate the fundamental rights of migrants. And I'll make a quick stop here because I want to invite you to reflect that we don't need more differences between illegal and legal aliens. It is not true that a person might be called illegal. It is not true that some people are more valuable than others because of where they were born, or the language they speak, or the color of their skin. Tomorrow, when you guys became successful lawyers, I'm sure you will, you're in a great institution, I invite you to work from your own positions as corporate lawyers, of top officials, academics, or businessmen, to recognize, to fight for the dignity and equality of the people. There is not a single human being in the world who is illegal. It can be not documented, which is quite different. And thanks to young generations, all generations, I'm not that old, we are getting more sense to respect the great dignity that every human being deserves. Another human right that we must protect from any consulate is the legal rights, the right to access to justice. According to the Vienna Convention, states as consular function represent or arrange appropriate representation for nationals of the sending state before the courts and other authorities of the receiving states. This represents a major challenge, especially in a country like America, where access to legal services can be very, very expensive. For this reason, you can imagine that at the consulate, we have a small army of lawyers. We provide legal advice or virtually all matters using our own lawyers and outsourcing exercise. We do hire external lawyers to protect our community. So, for example, we offer support to people facing criminal charges, not only by providing translation services, but also by offering accompaniment by a lawyer who can verify a due process of law and that all the steps of the process are carried out properly and even offer defense strategy. The same applies to cases for family and civil matters. In the case of family matters where the custody of children is involved, in labor matters so that they can have access to minimum labor warranties in working conditions, or even in immigration matters so that they have a way of accessing migration documentation. So far, we talk about the rights to identity, access to justice, which are two rights that are traditionally associated with consular duty. But now I am going to take a step forward and tell you how the Mexican consulate protects rights that are traditionally reserved to the national sphere or to the local sphere of the local authorities. The legal basis of this is supported in the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations, when it states in Article 5H that one function of consulates is, quotes, safeguarding within the limits imposed by the laws and regulations of the receiving state the interest of minors and other persons who are nationals of the sending state. And we certainly take this tax very seriously. As I told you, in New York, we have more than 1 million Mexicans, one of the largest populations of Mexican nationals in the world. There are more Mexicans here than in many cities in Mexico, Take the right to health, for example. At the heart of the problems of the health system in New York, especially for migrants, lies the accessibility issue. Health services may be available in certain cases when there is space in hospitals. However, not all the population can access them because of several barriers. In the case of migrants, this accessibility obstacle involves an economic barrier. And, more important than that, a barrier related to immigration status. Health insurance and most health services require, in addition to money, information or documents that most migrants do not have, mainly social security numbers. Furthermore, misinformation leads migrants to experience fear, uncertainty in their interaction with any kind of authority, including doctors and hospitals. This fear is strongly linked to the possibility of having their immigration status questioned and consequently being deported. To protect the right to health of Mexican migrants, the consulate focuses on breaking down the accessibility of obstacles. While we do not have a team of doctors that can provide care to the entire community, we have been working to have in a constant collaboration with hospitals, clinics, doctors, and NGOs. All these types of partners and associations have a community outreach departments that are generally the ones that will provide services free for the Mexican migrants. Another right that we similarly protect is our community right to work. Once again, of course, this issue is limited to a large extent by the immigration issue. Therefore, an important part of the work we do on this issue has to do with our diplomatic relationship with local authorities. We use the relationships we have formed, we have created, to promote the creation of laws and public policies that can guarantee basic rights to our migrant workers. I'm talking about very basic labor rights, such as health insurance in case of accidents, minimum wage, holiday of pregnancy days, These are the most basic rights for any worker. And in most cases, they are ignored in the case of migrants due to their undocumented status. For these reasons, as I mentioned a moment ago, we also protect these rights by litigation or by persuasion. I will give the explanation of persuasion at the Q&A session. There is a third dimension which has to do with the training, and this is a space of opportunity that we recently identified in order to foster our community. Various industries in the States require certifications in order to access employment. The work we have been doing recently is to offer those certifications from the consulate so that our migrants can have access to better jobs. And basically, these workshops are required for the construction industry or in the food industry. Because many of these industries are sustained by the work of migrants, the National Conference of States legislatures estimate that the Latinx were responsible for putting food on the tables of the more than 300 million US citizens in 2020, during the worst part of the pandemic. Latinx immigrants constitute 80% of all agricultural and food industry workers, 80%, and about 50% of them are Mexicans. They are the ones who harvest, transport, prepare, and many times deliver the food that this country consumes every single day. I think they deserve to be recognized and rewarded for their hard work according to law. We have already talked about the rights traditionally associated with consular duties. We have also talked about other rights, such as the right to health and the right to work, and how we aim to protect them from the consulate tools. Now I want to take a step back and talk to you a little bit about how the consulate has adapted the social reality that faces every single day. I want to talk to you about the protection of human rights in extraordinary times. I want to talk about the protection of the migrants in the times of the COVID-19. When we reflect on the issue a few years down the road, we realize that, of course, healthcare workers were essential to get through this pandemic, of course. But there are other kinds of workers just as important. I'm referring, for example, to workers in the food industry or workers in the hygiene industry who likewise did not stop working in the face of the pandemic, and thanks to them, the city never collapsed. I'm, of course, referring to New York City. Just a few days after the pandemic began, we at the consulate realized that our migrants are an essential part of these industries. That is why we create a work plan to address their needs, their immediate needs. The axis of the work plan were therefore, first, implement all possible preventive measures. Second, provide prompt and efficient care to all migrants affected by COVID through hospitals and medical care. And third, work hand in hand with the authorities at local level and state level. Sadly, the pandemic affected thousands and thousands of Mexican migrants in the state. I just want to add briefly that the most heated minority because COVID-19 in New York were the Mexicans. We have at least 5,000 people who passed away in 4 months. They were frontliners, of course. They were working every single day to deliver food to all the houses that the people were requiring. In the most sensitive cases, in which our peasants died because of this disease, or the delivery boys, as they call themselves, we provide, first of all, dignity, supporting their families as best as we could. We even carry out the largest remains repatriation our country has ever done in its history by sending almost 500 cremation urns through Mexican Air Force planes back to Mexico. And later we installed a commemorative plaque at the consulate to honor their memory for their hard work, their great commitment. In addition, we took care of protecting our migrants in all consular matters. We coordinate all information campaign about preventive measures against COVID-19 in Spanish and also in various indigenous original languages. Let me give you another another number. 250,000 Mexicans living in New York, they don't even speak Spanish. Imagine how hard it is for them. They have their local original languages. So we need to translate them in their original languages, all the information, so they can be safe and they have information and they can take decisions. Finally, when vaccination began, we made sure that the Mexican population was the first to receive it in New York. As I was saying, all the consulates were asking to the state and local authorities for a vaccination clinic at their consulates. I spoke with the mayor, I spoke with the governor, and I just showed them the numbers of the people who passed away and that they were heroes, they were frontliners. And of course, the first community and the first consulate who have the vaccination clinic for COVID were the Mexican consulate. And thanks to that, we vaccinate a lot of people from the community, especially those who were in great need. And now they're safe. And thanks to the support of the government, we do this great partnership. And they're back in the streets, working in 100% capacity and happily, because they're trying to get alive in America and what I call a Mexican-American dream. I want to end this brief presentation. In conclusion, I want to, the message that I would like to deliver is that any institution, including consulates anywhere in the world, must adapt to changing times and changing societies. The institution of the consulate has undergone such a transformation from an institution for the protection originally of commercial interests to an institution for the protection of the interests of all citizens and the fundamental human rights of the citizens living abroad. And this goes beyond simply providing assistance in the case a person has lost their identity documents or has been detained for any thing at the airport. When we take this commitment seriously, the protection of national interests involves providing assistance on every specific issues. At the Mexican consulate, we have focused this transformation on the protection of human rights. And this has allowed us to adapt to real needs of our public through the exercise of consular powers according to law, international law and local law, such as direct intervention on behalf of our people and diplomatic relations with local authorities. For that, I want to thank you for your attention. And I'm ready for the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Consul General, for that really insightful lecture, both on both the history of the consular function and really the present and future of it. I'd like to thank you even further by presenting you with a token of our appreciation for your visit with us today. And in celebration of your being our 2023 Sloan Lecture.
Thanks so much.
So now I'd like to ask Professor Tom McDonald to join us at the podium and to lead our Q&A session. For those of you who don't know, Professor McDonald's an expert in international law who has published extensively on issues pertaining to international human rights law and international refugee law as well. Professor McDonald.
Thank you, Horace, for the generous introduction. And it's my privilege to serve as the moderator of the Q&A session. Anyone who's interested in speaking, please raise their hand. Okay. Mr. Grunewald, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for that presentation. I'm Sasha Greenewalt. I teach constitutional law here and international law, so I was very interested in your talk. And I was also reminded, as you were speaking, that my former law firm where I worked before I became a professor represented your government in a very big dispute in the International Court of Justice against the United States involving consular relations. And I know you'll be familiar with it, but for those who are not, the issue was that under the Vienna Convention, consular relations, as U.S. citizens, if we travel anywhere else in the world, it's good to know that if one of us is detained or arrested in a foreign country where we don't understand how things work, we have a right to assistance from our consulate, and we have a right to be told of that. And the issue in this case is that the United States was not respecting that right. And in fact, that was not even part of the dispute. It was completely conceded that these violations in a series of cases were occurring. And the reason for it largely, as I understand it, was that in our federal system of government, where we have all these different local law enforcement departments across the country, it's not any sort of evil intent in most cases. It's simply that the local law enforcement and the local police are unaware of the existence of the Vienna Convention. And so I'm just wondering, I haven't sort of heard much about this issue since then. And I'm wondering if, as the outcome of all these cases and all the attention that came to the issue, whether we've seen any improvement in the United States at the law enforcement level in terms of, being aware of these obligations.
Thank you so much, dear colleague. I'm also a professor of constitutional law, and I'm not really aware of this case in specific, but of course we do have the right, what we know as consular notification, which I think that was a legal issue. And whenever something irregular happens, according to Mexican law, if it's the case of an American citizen who has been detained improperly, and there is not the formal according to law, which means the time and the consulate of the jurisdiction where it's the American embassy or the American government, you can go to the courts, to the federal court, not to local court. You can sue the government for this observation. And of course, we have in Mexico a remedy called juicio de amparo, which is sort of saying more or less, if we are comparing both sides of the law, it's the habeas corpus remedy. And whenever you promote and start a remedy of juicio de amparo, the court immediately will grant the right to the detained and immediately release him, because there was a great default of the local authorities. And I want to come back with the same observation that you have, of course, and as Consul General, I have had these stories every single day. Local authorities, they're not aware of the Vienna Convention. And whenever you try to explain them, they say, why? I mean, that's not in our code. No, but it's part of the law, of the American law. So I think you need a lot of information to spread information and to educate different authorities that deal, I think, with consular matters, so they can be aware and have more sensitivity for all the people who have been having this type of problem. And in that sense, the first right they have, it's the consular notification that will help a lot, because immediately the American consulate or the Mexican consulate can bring all the consular assistance that they may require. We'll talk later.
Other questions? Professor Merton?
Hi. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Consul, for covering so many issues in such a relatively concise way. It's really impressive. I'm Vanessa Merton. I'm the director of our Immigration Justice Clinic, in which our student attorneys provide free legal services to indigent immigrants who are seeking to regularize their status. and avoid deportation, because in fact, they are legally entitled under our law to be in this country and to work in this country because they do qualify. The problem is always that they don't have the legal services to accomplish that. And I was so pleased that you mentioned and stressed access to justice as the key right, as actually a type of law enforcement. I like to think of it. We are simply trying to make the United States government obey its own law. But the question I have for you is, does the consulate do you in your duties? I'm sure you are aware, and I'm sure you hear from the nationals that you work with, of the enormous problem because of the dearth of legal services available to people, of a combination of incompetent and malevolent fraudsters, scam artists, rip-off artists who absolutely plague and infest immigrant communities, certainly including the Mexican community, rip people off for huge amounts of money for bogus nonsense, fraudulent claims, because people don't know, have no way of determining what is legitimate and what is not. And also, you know, they don't just lose money, right? They end up in deportation proceedings when they shouldn't. They end up accused of fraud when they have been victimized, and they end up ultimately families and communities being disrupted by deportations because they didn't have access to legitimate legal services. Is there anything that the consulate can do, that you can do to better educate your national community to be aware of this risk, to be aware and to advise and provide information on how to avoid being victimized in the first place? And if they are victimized, to make sure that they are aware of the potential to apply for a certain type of visa for victims of crime, what I call immigrant representation crime. Is that a area in which the consulate could provide greater services, perhaps? And I'd be interested to hear just what you're able to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. I think it's a very important question. We use the social networks that we have in order to prevent this type of crimes, frauds. And basically what we do is to socialize all this information and spread with the highest capacity we have, so the people will realize that there is unscrupulous people that will try to take advantage of their situation because they are in great ignorance with what it's the deal with the law, the local law. And also they take advantage because they are in great, they are desperate. So they take, I think, unfair advantage of that. And they ask for them for a lot of money they don't have. They go through debts even. And what we do is to denounce them. If these guys are in a specific bar association, we denounce them with the bar association they belong. If that's the case, we denounce them with the federal authorities, FBI, frauds. And also, we try to go directly to their law offices and present our complaint with letters and saying that avoid harming our people. And sometimes I go personally, and when they see the Consul General, they behave more or less. They try to behave. So that's what we do. But basically, what we do is preventive actions through social networks, saying be aware of this. And if we identify the law firms of the people who is doing that, we put their names because we have the evidence that these guys are doing unfair actions against our community.
Jay, did you have a question?
Honor to be able to speak with you. I have the privilege to work for the U.S. Coast Guard and with the Mexican Navy on several occasions off of Crucecita. And we encountered all kinds of law enforcement situations down there that we see spilling over up into the United States, and likewise back into Mexico in the economy interchange that happens. And with so many complex issues that the U.S. and Mexico both have to address, what you said about the need for our institutions to evolve in order to meet the new challenges as they arrive, the new societal and social norms, what would you say to a room of future lawyers? If we had to prioritize one to bring about as soon as possible, would be one of the changes that we need in order to evolve our institutions to meet the complex challenges that we have right now.
Well, that's the toughest question I ever heard in a long time.
Thank you.
If I know the answer properly, I think I will be promoted to be the next ambassador to Washington, DC. But I think that we have not one, but if you allow me, I will say 3 main topics. In this very complex, I will say, relation with our new challenges, migration clearly is one, commerce or trade, and security. Security or national security matters. There must be a way to avoid the illegal, unfair drug trafficking to America, but there must be a way to stop all the guns and big arms that Americans send to Mexico. We must stop the violence that we do have, and I think we can have an agreement. It's for the benefit of our people and for the benefit of our youth generations that we're trying to build for the future. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Other questions? Yes.
Hi, my name is Tulan. I'm a first-year student. My question to you is, you mentioned giving recognition to undocumented workers, especially in light of COVID and how their impact on our agricultural and hygiene systems was what kept us going. What are some real ways that you can give recognition to those people without also endangering them?
What I meant is recognition according to labor laws. In America, you can be an undocumented migrant, but if you're working, you have labor laws, rights. So that's what I meant. That according to the current legal framework, labor legal framework that you do have, just respect it for the labor rights they do deserve, because they work very hard and they do have important, I think, apportations to the society in general. So what I'm asking is just to recognize the fair labor rights that they do have according to the legal framework that you do have for labor rights, basically.
If I may ask just a question, but the real difficulty with undocumented workers is that they are under the threat of deportation, or as we now call it, removal. So what, if anything, has the Mexican government done, to try to help, convince our government authorities to regularize status of such individuals?
The thing is that I think we need to work creating sensitivity with the employers, in the sense that whenever they are hiring, they should be aware that they are having the benefit of very cheap labor force, and they're not, in addition, they're not paying fair wages. They're not recognizing fair labor rights that they do have, even though they're not documented migrants. And what I think is that you need to work with the employers and make like a sense of feeling or sensitivity that it will be in the benefit of their own corporations or their own workplaces to have with better rights, with the great recognition that the workers deserve, in the benefit of more productive places to work, fair places where they can work with better environments. That's what I think.
I think we have time for one more question, Professor Naroan.
Hello, my name is Smith Narula. We just met. I teach international environmental and human rights law at the law school on one of the courses. I wanted to ask you to touch base on, expand a little bit more on the issue of trade and thinking about it in the context both of economic security for Mexicans and Mexican Americans, but also in the context of the consulate's role. And I mention it because my understanding is that so much of what is driving migration is the diminishing of economic opportunity in Mexico and other countries, which in itself has been brought about by very lopsided trade agreements, including NAFTA, for example, that I know drove many Mexican farmers or really impoverished them and led them to seek more opportunities here. Is there a role that the consulate plays traditionally in trying to level the playing field in terms of trade, so that one of the human rights that's protected is also the right to stay and to be able to secure economic opportunities and dignity in one's own country, in addition to finding those opportunities here?
Basically, what the consulate do is to promote and protect the rights and interests of their foreigners, of their citizens abroad. So what we do is to protect the rights of the people who is living in New York. But according to your question, the new USMCA, which is the new NAFTA 2 version, by now, and thanks to this great instrument, Mexico, we do have like 8.5 of annual rate of inflation, which is one of the lowest in the region. We do have 3.5 of economic growth. We are even beyond of the economy of America. And by now, the currency, peso dollar, it's the first time, like in almost 30 years, that the dollar is coming down with the peso. So economic opportunities now we do have in Mexico. It's not an economic factor, but I think it might be the social factor, which includes violence, I think, which is another factor that we might try to work and talk about. But the springs of the economic recovery and the possibility to have important and sustainable economic growth in the future, I think we do have it. And we have a very important instrument, which right now it's the most important commercial trade worldwide. And Mexico and America are part of it as partners. Thank you so much.
Okay, please help me thank Consul General